Welcome to my another session. In this session, I have a talk about different parts of the forebrain and their function. In my last video, I have already told about the forebrain. It has three important parts. One is the olfactory lobe, second one is the cerebrum, and third one is the diencephalon. Out of these parts, cerebrum highly developed and it covers almost all part of the brain except some part of the hindbrain. Suppose that this is the neural tube. The development of brain takes place from this tube, which is known as the neural tube. The anteriormost portion of neural tube, which differentiated into forebrain, and the posterior portion of neural tube, which is developed into hindbrain. And the middle portion in between forebrain and the hindbrain, the region of the neural tube, which is differentiated into midbrain. And the rest portion of such neural tube, which is developed into spinal cord. So this is the neural tube. From this tube, brain is developed, and the anteriormost portion, which developed into forebrain, the posterior portion of neural tube, which developed into hindbrain, and the rest posterior portion, which developed into spinal cord, and in between forebrain and the hindbrain, the very small region which differentiated into midbrain. Forebrain, it has three important parts. The anteriormost part of the forebrain, which differentiated into olfactory lobe, the middle portion of the forebrain, which differentiated into cerebrum, and the last part of the forebrain, a very small region, which is differentiated into diencephalon. Cerebrum, this is the highly developed part of the forebrain, or this is the highly developed part of the forebrain, highly growth, and it covers almost all part of the brain, and which is known as the cerebrum. So this is known as the cerebrum. Cerebrum developed in such a way that it envelopes almost all part like olfactory lobe, diencephalon, midbrain, and some part of the hindbrain, totally covered by the cerebrum. So the forebrain, which is differentiated into three parts, or the forebrain, it has three important parts. The anteriormost part is known as the olfactory lobe. The middle part, which is highly developed, which is known as the cerebrum, and the posterior to the cerebrum, there is a very small area which is known as the diencephalon. The alternative name of the olfactory lobe is the rhyencephalon, cerebrum is the telencephalon, and diencephalon, the another name of diencephalon is the thalamencephalon. So how these parts arranged? So because of the high development of cerebrum, which covers almost all part of the brain. Suppose that this is the pons, this is the medulla, and this is the spinal cord, and this is the cerebellum, a part of the hindbrain, and this is the cerebrum. This is the cerebrum. This is the pons. This is the medulla oblongata. This is the spinal cord. This is the cerebellum, which is highly folded region of the brain, and this is the cerebrum. Here, you clearly observe that cerebrum, this is the highly developed, highly growth part of the brain. and it covers almost all part of the brain, like the olfactory lobe. It is not visible here. The olfactory lobe, it is visible if you observe from the ventral side. So it is visible, olfactory lobe is visible at the ventral side, and this is the figure of the lateral side. Diencephalon completely covered by the cerebrum. Midbrain also completely covered by the cerebrum. Only the hindbrain, some portion of the hindbrain like pons varoli, medulla oblongata, cerebrum, some part of the cerebellum also visible. So the midbrain completely covered, diencephalon completely covered by the cerebrum. Medulla oblongata, pons varoli, upper to the pons varoli, this portion, that is the diencephalon. That is the diencephalon, and posterior to diencephalon, this portion, that is the midbrain. That is the midbrain. So the midbrain, diencephalon, pons varoli, medulla oblongata. So the diencephalon, midbrain, pons varoli, and medulla oblongata, all these things, it forms the brain stem. It is known as the brain stem, or this is known as the life supporting system. So the midbrain, diencephalon, pons varoli, medulla oblongata, all these things, it forms the stem of the brain. So the whole brain which present over the brain stem, present over the midbrain, diencephalon, pons varoli, medulla oblongata, and which forms the brain stem, and it is known as the life supporting system. So come to the forebrain. So forebrain, it has three important parts. One is the olfactory lobe, second one is the cerebrum, and third one is the diencephalon. Cerebrum, this is the, out of these three parts, cerebrum, it is highly developed and highly growth, and which cover almost all part of the brain. Cerebrum, which present on the surface of the midbrain, diencephalon, or the pons varoli and the medulla oblongata. That's why these three parts which form the brain stem, and which also known as the life supporting system. Now come to the olfactory lobe. As I told that such olfactory lobe, because of the development of cerebrum, the high development of cerebrum, the olfactory lobe which goes downward, and now the olfactory lobe present at the ventral side of the brain. So let me draw the ventral surface or a ventral view of the brain. Suppose that this is the ventral view of the brain. Here you can easily find the cerebrum, easily find the olfactory lobe. This is the frontal lobe of the cerebrum. I will go through the frontal lobe and different lobes of the cerebrum. This is the temporal lobe, and this is the lateral fissure which divide the frontal lobe with the temporal lobe. And this is the pons varoli, this is the medulla oblongata, this is the spinal cord, and this portion is the cerebellum. This is the cerebellum. And at the ventral side, you can easily observe that there is the olfactory lobe, which is club shaped. The anterior region, it has the bulb which is known as the olfactory bulb, and the posterior region, it is the slender rod-like structure which is known as the olfactory tract. So the olfactory lobe, which is totally covered or enveloped by the cerebrum. That's why the olfactory lobe, one pair of olfactory lobe present in human and which present at the ventral side of the brain. Such olfactory lobe, it is differentiated into two parts. The anterior portion, it has the swollen body which is known as the olfactory bulb, and posterior to olfactory bulb there is the slender rod-like structure which is known as the olfactory tract. So the olfactory bulb and olfactory tract, which collectively known as the olfactory lobe. Such olfactory lobe, it has the space inside it, and such space is known as the rhinocele. The space of olfactory lobe is known as the rhinocele. The first cranial nerve, that is the olfactory nerve, the first cranial nerve or the olfactory nerve which developed from olfactory lobe. Such olfactory lobe, it regulates the sense of smell. Those animals have the more sense of smell, they have the highly developed olfactory lobe. For example, in case of carnivorous like lion, tiger, dog, they have the highly developed olfactory lobe as compared to us. We have the rudimentary or underdeveloped olfactory lobe, but it is differentiated into olfactory bulb and the olfactory tract, and it has the space which is known as the rhinocele. Now come to the cerebrum. Cerebrum, this is the largest part of the brain which is highly developed, well developed, and this is the center of learning, center of reasoning, center of knowledge, and which also contains the sense of the center of different sense, and which also contains the center of different reflexes also. Such cerebrum, which is divided into two cerebral hemisphere. It is divided into two cerebral hemisphere by the longitudinal fissure. So the longitudinal fissure which divide the cerebrum into two hemisphere, and these hemisphere are known as the cerebral hemisphere. So this is the two hemisphere. Suppose that this is the right cerebral hemisphere and this is the left cerebral hemisphere, and this is the fissures or the depression which divide the two cerebrum into two cerebral hemisphere, and such fissure is known as the longitudinal fissure. So this longitudinal fissure which divide the cerebrum into two hemispheres, it is partially divided into two hemispheres, and this cerebrum which also divided into four lobes because of the presence of different fissures, and this is the dorsal view of the cerebrum or the brain. Only here cerebrum is visible here. The surface of cerebrum, it has a number of folds. It has a number of folds or the convolutions or the ridges. Suppose that the surface of the cerebrum which has number of folds. Suppose that this is the section. Number of folds means this is the one fold, this is the another fold, and this is another one fold, and this is another fold. So these are the folds. These folds also known as convolutions. These are also known as the convolutions, or such convolutions also known as ridges, or such ridges also known as gyri. Singular is gyrus. So this is, suppose that this is the gyrus, and the plural is gyri. The plural is known as the gyri. So these fold are the convolutions. So two convolutions or two gyri which is separated from each other by a furrow or the depression. This is the furrow or the depression which is known as the sulcus. Which is known as the sulcus, or the plural is sulci. The plural is known as the sulci. Singular is the sulcus. So the surface of the brain, it has a number of gyri and the sulci. So because of the presence of gyri and sulci, the surface area of cerebrum, it highly increased, immensely increased the surface area of the cerebrum. So from this figure, it is confirmed that the cerebrum, which is divided into two hemispheres, one is the right cerebral hemisphere, another is the left cerebral hemisphere, and the division of such hemisphere takes place by the presence of longitudinal fissure, which divide the cerebral hemisphere partially into two halves or two hemisphere, right cerebral hemisphere and the left cerebral hemisphere. The most part of the most activity of the right part of the body, which is controlled by the left cerebral hemisphere, and the most activity of the right part of the left part of the body, which is controlled by the right cerebral hemisphere. It is vice versa. So the left activity, the left part of the body activity, which is controlled by the right cerebral hemisphere, the activity of the right side of the body mostly, which is controlled by the left cerebral hemisphere. And the surface of cerebral hemisphere, which has number of folds, these folds are also known as the convolutions or the ridges, and these folds are known as the gyri, and the singular is gyrus. And if you take the section, this is the fold, this is the convolutions which go upward, and this is known as the gyrus, and the depression or the furrow or which goes in downward in between two gyri, and such furrow is known as the sulcus, singular, and the sulci is the plural. So number of gyri and the sulci present on the surface of the cerebrum, and which immensely increase the surface area of cerebrum. And because of the presence of number of fissure, the cerebral hemisphere is divided into each cerebral hemisphere divided into 4 lobes. Each cerebral hemisphere which is divided into 4 lobes because of presence of different fissures. This is the structure of the cerebrum. This is the lateral figure of the cerebrum. This is the surface. It has a number of gyri, number of sulci. It is divided into 4 lobes. Each cerebral hemisphere is divided into 4 lobes. And the name of such lobe on the basis of the corresponding skeletal bones. And suppose that this is the frontal lobe. So frontal lobe which present below the frontal bone of the skull. So each lobe it is named on the basis of the corresponding bone of the skull. This is the frontal lobe, this is the temporal lobe, this is the parietal lobe, and the posterior is the occipital lobe. So 4 lobes are present, but here another lobe also present which is known as the insula. Another lobe, insula present, and which also known as island of rain. So this is very small lobe present and which is hidden by the temporal lobe. It is hidden by the temporal lobe. So these lobes, it has different fissures, and these fissures, these are known as the lateral fissure. So there is the lateral fissure. This is the lateral fissures. This is the lateral fissures. This is lateral fissure. This is the lateral fissure, which also known as fissure of Sylvius. Fissure of Sylvius. So the lateral fissure which goes from down to dorsal side or down to upside, and below the another fissures, and this fissure is known as the central fissure. This is the central fissure. Such central fissure which also known as the fissure of Rolando. The central fissure which is known as the fissure of Rolando. Fissure of Rolando. So the frontal lobe, this is the frontal lobe present below the frontal bone of the skull. This is the frontal lobe. This frontal lobe which differentiated from the temporal lobe by the lateral fissure, and the frontal lobe which present in front of the lateral fissure or in front of the central fissure. The central fissure also divide the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. The central fissure which also known as the fissure of the Rolando. The median, the dorsal median region of the cerebral hemisphere, and this lobe which is known as the parietal lobe. So the dorsal median region of the cerebrum which is known as the parietal lobe. This is the parietal lobe. This parietal lobe which again separated from the occipital lobe by the another fissures, and this is known as the parieto-occipital fissure. This is known as the parieto-occipital fissure. So the parieto-occipital fissure, which divide the occipital lobe from the parietal lobe, or the parietal lobe separate from the occipital lobe because of the presence of parieto-occipital fissure. The occipital lobe which present the posterior side of the brain. So this is the frontal region and this is the posterior region. So the posterior portion of the brain which has the occipital lobe. This is the occipital lobe which present at the posterior side of the brain. This is the occipital lobe. This is the occipital lobe. And another lobe is present which is known as the insula. Another lobe is present which is known as the insula and which is hidden. Suppose that this is the insula lobe which is hidden by the temporal lobe, or which is covered by the temporal lobe and present at the side region. This is known as the insula. The temporal lobe, this lobe which present at the side of the cerebrum, both lateral side of the cerebrum, this is known as the temporal lobe. This is the temporal lobe. So lobe number 1, 2, 3 and 4. So actually each cerebral hemisphere divided into 4 lobes because of presence of these fissures. One is the frontal lobe which is separated from the parietal lobe by the presence of central fissure or the fissure of Rolando. The parietal lobe which is divided from the occipital lobe by the presence of parieto-occipital fissures. And the side, there is the another lobe which is known as the temporal lobe which is separated from the frontal lobe by the presence of lateral fissure or the fissure of Sylvius. So these are the different fissures and 4 lobes. And beside these 4 lobes, another lobe also reported which is very small, which is known as the insula or the islands of the rail. Such islands of rails present or hidden by the temporal lobe, or which present just beneath the temporal lobe. If you take the section, then you find, suppose that this is the pons, this is the medulla oblongata, and this is the spinal cord. This is the cerebrum. This cerebrum, two cerebral hemisphere which present on the seat of nervous band. So the 2 cerebral hemisphere present on the band of nervous seat of the nervous seat or the band of nervous seat, which is known as the corpus callosum. So the 2 cerebral hemisphere, these 2 cerebral hemisphere present on the nervous band of the seat, which is known as the corpus callosum. This is known as corpus callosum. This is known as corpus callosum. This corpus callosum at the back side, there is the swollen body or the mass which is known as the splenium. This is known as the splenium. and the front side, the bending portion of the corpus callosum, which is known as the genu. So this is the genu, and this is the corpus callosum, and this is the splenium. So both the cerebral hemisphere present on the nervous sheath or the nervous band, which is known as the corpus callosum. Such corpus callosum which present inside the deep, you take the section, then you find such corpus callosum. Such corpus callosum at the posterior region, it has the swollen body which is known as the splenium, and the front it has the band like structure or the bending of the corpus callosum in a front, which is known as the genu. And if you look the cerebrum, then there is the presence of gray matter as well as white matter. So the gray matter which present at the outer surface of the brain or the cerebrum. So this is the cerebrum, the outer portion which has the gray matter. It is gray matter means this region which is made up of unmyelinated neurons. There is no myelinated neuron. So this is the gray matter. And the middle portion or the inner region, this portion which is differentiated into or which contains the white matter, because it is made up of myelinated neurons. So the outer region is known as the cortex region or cerebral cortex. And the inner region is known as the cerebral medulla. So the cerebrum, which is differentiated into two regions, the outer gray matter, which is known as the cerebral cortex, and the inner region, which is made up of white matter, is known as the cerebral medulla. So the cerebral cortex, which is made up of gray matter, G-R-E-Y, or you may write G-R-A-Y. This is the gray matter, because there is no myelinated neurons. And the cerebral medulla, which contains white matter. White matter means it contains myelinated neurons. Myelinated means the fatty myelin sheath present on the neuron. That's why which is white in color. So because of the presence of myelin sheath, that's why these neurons form the white matter at the medulla region. And these two regions collectively known as the pallium. So the cerebral cortex and the cerebral medulla, which is known as the pallium. So pallium, which is divided into two regions, the outer cortex and inner medulla. And there is the question, why only the cerebral cortex forming the number of folds? Because at the time of development, as compared to the white matter, only gray matter increase more and more. So during the development, because of the formation or the development or growth of the cerebral cortex, the speed is more, that's why it gets folded at the time of development. So at the time of development, the white matter as compared to white matter, the gray matter which grows speedily or which developed or increase the size speedily as compared to the white matter. Because of the addition of more and more gray matter as compared to white matter, and the gray matter present at the outside, that's why the surface getting folded or the surface become folded, and that's why the formation of number of gyri and sulci are present. And here another thing is that such cerebrum which also contains the space or the ventricle, and these are known as the lateral ventricle. The right cerebral hemisphere, the space present in the right cerebral hemisphere, which is known as the first ventricle, and the left cerebral hemisphere, the ventricle contains, which is known as the second ventricle. So the space present inside the cerebrum and such space are known as the lateral ventricle. The first ventricle and the second ventricle collectively known as lateral ventricle. So some of the gray matter also present in deep region of cerebral medulla, So some of the gray matter present isolated patch like structure present in the deep region of white matter, and these are known as the nuclei. These are known as the basal nuclei because these may present the ventral side of the lateral ventricle. Suppose that there is the space, and below the space at base of the ventricle, these gray matter, the patches of gray matter are present below the lateral ventricle, and these are known as the basal nuclei. These are known as basal nuclei. Nucleus, the plural is basal nuclei. Such basal nuclei, these are the patch of gray matter. Such patch of gray matter which contains more number of cell body of neuron. This contains the cell bodies of neuron. And sometimes number of basal nuclei present base of the lateral ventricle or around the lateral ventricle. Now such basal nuclei is named as basal ganglion. So basal ganglion which may contain number of basal nuclei. The basal nuclei is made up of the cluster of cell bodies. The basal nucleus, this is the cluster of cell body, or this is the isolated patch of gray matter inside the white matter, and these are known as the basal nuclei or the basal ganglion. So cerebrum, which is made up of two parts, one is the pallium or another is the basal ganglion. So cerebrum, which is divided into two parts, One is the pallium and another is the basal ganglion. Pallium, it has two regions, the outer cortex made up of the gray matter and inner is the white matter, and which is known as the cerebral medulla. It is gray in color because there is no myelinated neuron, but the inner portion of the brain which is white in color because there is the myelinated neuron. And another thing is that the isolated patch of gray matter also found below the or base of the ventricle or the lateral ventricle. These are known as the basal ganglion or the basal nuclei. And these basal nuclei is nothing but these are the cluster of gray matter or the cell bodies of the neuron. On the basis of function, the basal nuclei or basal ganglion, it may be two types. One is maybe the motor type, another may be the sensory. The sensory basal nuclei, they receive the sensory impulse and interpret. The motor basal nuclei, they generate the motor impulse by the comparison of input information with the past information, and accordingly they relay or generate the motor impulse. So these basal nuclei or the basal ganglion actually control the different sense of motor sense, different sense of our body, and it also contains different reflexes of our body. Such basal nuclei may interconnected by different nerves fiber to each other, or it may interconnected by different part of the brains like thalamus, diencephalon, and other part of the diencephalon. So now, what are the different senses are present in the different lobes of the brain? So now come to the different sensory center of the cerebrum. Cerebrum has different area and they have different functions. So let me draw the different lobes of the cerebrum. This is the temporal lobe, this is the frontal, this is the central fissures, this is the temporal lobe, this is the frontal lobe, this is the central fissure, this is the lateral fissure, this is the parieto-occipital fissure, this is the occipital lobe, this is the parietal lobe. The frontal lobe, it has different parts. Suppose that this is the motor area, this is the premotor area, and there is another area is the Broca or the Broca's area. This is the motor area, this is the premotor, this is the Broca's area. So these area, they are assigned as different important function. The motor area of frontal lobe, which controls the voluntary movement of muscles. It controls the voluntary movement of muscle. And the premotor area, which present in front of the motor area, which is known as the premotor area, which controls the involuntary movements of muscle. The Broca's area, this is the important area and which is known as the motor speech area. The Broca's area, this is known as the motor speech area. And there is the another center also present in between the premotor or near to the premotor and the motor region. This is known as the association area. This is known as the association area. So the frontal lobe, it has the different lobes. So the motor area, which control the voluntary activity of the muscles, the premotor area, which control the involuntary movements of the muscles, Broca's area, it is the motor speech area, and the association area, which help for the learning, memory, reasoning. So the processing of input information takes place inside the association area, and accordingly new motor sensations are generated from the association area. Parietal lobe, which contains the important area which is known as the somaesthetic area. This is the somaesthetic area. This is the area of general perceptions like pressure, temperature, touch. So this is the somaesthetic area which perceive the pain, touch, temperature. This is the pressure. So this is the sense of the general perceptions. And just below the somaesthetic area, there is the another area which is known as the gustatory area, which present behind the central fissure. This is known as the gustatory area. This is the gustatory area. This is the sense of taste related to tongue, gustatory organ. This is the sense of taste, gustatory area, which present in the parietal lobe. The temporal lobe, which also contains three important area, the olfactory area, which present the dorsal side of the temporal lobe. This is the olfactory area, and which related to the sense of smell. So it controls the sense of smell. And near below the olfactory area, there is the auditory area. This is the sense of sound related to ear, the sense of sound, auditory area. And below the auditory area, the temporal lobe, the ventral side, there is the Wernicke's area. This is the Wernicke's area. This is the understanding of speech, the Wernicke's area, which is known as the understanding of speech. You understand the speech of anyone because of the activity of the Wernicke's area. So the temporal lobe, which contains the olfactory, auditory, and the Wernicke's area. The occipital lobe, which contains the one important area, is known as the visual area. It is the sense of light. So let me repeat again. The frontal lobe, which has three important, the motor area, premotor area, Broca's area, and another one is the association area. So important three, and the association area, this is another important. So 4 number of sensory areas are present. Motor area, which control the voluntary movement of the muscles, premotor area, which control the involuntary movements of the muscles, Broca's area, it is the motor speech area, and the association area, which the activity of such association area, which help for the learning of the individual. It helps for the memory, it helps for the interpretation of input information, it stores some of the information, or it also generates some of the motor impulse also, and it is associated with the memory of the individual. The parietal lobe, it has the 2 important sensory area. The one is the somaesthetic area. This regulates the general perceptions like pain, touch, temperature, pressure. And another is the gustatory area related to the tongue, which which regulate the sense of taste. The temporal lobe, which has three important areas: dorsal, that is the olfactory area related to smell, the sense of smell; the auditory area, the sense of sound; the larynx area, the understanding of speech; and the occipital lobe, which contains the one important area, which is known as the visual area, which is the sensory to light. So this is the different functions of the cerebrum, and each function is controlled by the different area of the different lobe of the cerebrum. Now come to the diencephalon. Diencephalon, which also known as the thalamencephalon. Thalamencephalon, because it contains epithalmus, thalamus, and hypothalamus. So, what is the position of diencephalon? Suppose that this is the cerebrum, this is the cerebellum, this is the pons, medulla oblongata, and the spinal cord. So, below the cerebrum and upper region of the pons, in between cerebrum and the hindbrain, the diencephalon present. Diencephalon, this is the third part of the forebrain, and which present below the cerebrum and the upper side of the pons. That diencephalon, it has the space, and such space is known as the diocele. The space is known as diocele, and such diocele, which also known as the third ventricle of the brain. So let me draw the diocele. Suppose that this is the first ventricle, the ventricle of the right cerebral hemisphere, as I told earlier. Suppose that this is the first ventricle, and suppose that this is the second ventricle present inside the left cerebral hemisphere. Both the ventricle, first and second ventricle, collectively known as, these are known as the lateral ventricle. So these are known as the lateral ventricle. So these lateral ventricle, two lateral ventricles open in a common opening, and which is known as, that is the opening which communicate to the common opening. This opening is known as the interventricular foramen. So this is known as the interventricular foramen, or which also known as foramen of Monro. This is known as the foramen of Monro. Now, this two ventricle which connect with the third ventricle. So this is known as the third ventricle. This third ventricle also known as diocele. This is known as diocele. Such third ventricle which connect with the another ventricle present inside the pons or medulla oblongata, which is known as the fourth ventricle. So how many number of ventricles present in human brain? So four ventricles are present. First and second, collectively known as the lateral ventricle, and such lateral ventricle connect to each other to the third ventricle by the opening which is known as the foramen of Monro. Now the third ventricle which connect with the fourth ventricle through the another connection, and which is known as the ether of Sylvius, or it is also known as ether. So there is the important thing is that the lateral ventricle which connect with the third ventricle through the foramen of Monroe. So can you tell me some of the important foramen present in the human? So in human there is the obturator foramen which is present in the pelvic girdles, the pelvic girdle bone, obturator foramen. The foramen of Magnum which present the skull of the mammals or the almost all vertebrates. This is known as the foramen of Magnum. The foramen of Panija, the foramen of Panija which present in crocodiles, and this is the opening which connect the right and left aortic arches in crocodiles, which is known as the foramen of Panija. The foramen of ovale in the embryonic condition, the right atrium and the left atrium of heart connected through a opening which is known as the foramen of ovale. So what are the important foramen? The foramen of Magnum present in skull, the obturator foramen which present in the pelvic girdles, the foramen of Panija which present in crocodiles, the foramen of ovale present in heart at the embryonic condition. And this is the cerebral hemisphere. This is the cerebral hemisphere. And this portion, the fourth ventricle, which is covered by or surrounded by the cerebellum. So this is the cerebellum. This is the cerebral hemisphere. So the third ventricle or the diocele, this third ventricle which forms the thalamen or the diencephalon present around the third ventricle. So this portion is the diencephalon. If you take the section, then you find, suppose that this is the section of the third ventricle where this is the superior region, this is the inferior region, and this is the lateral region. The superior region of third ventricle which has some of the neural mass, and such neural mass which forms epithalamus. This is known as the epithalamus or epithalamus. Such epithalamus, it has the finger-like projection also, and such finger-like projection which is provided or which contains more blood vessels because of there is the fusion of the pia mater and which forms the anterior choroid plexus. So the epithalamus, the surface of epithalamus which contains more blood vessels and which form the anterior choroid plexus. So it forms the anterior choroid plexus. So the third ventricle, the lateral wall of the third ventricle which also contains the neural mass, and such neural mass which forms the right and left thalami. So this is known as the right and left thalami, and this form the thalamus. The inferior wall, the superior wall forms the epithalamus or the roof which forms the roof of the third ventricle. The floor of the third ventricle which also contains the neural mass and it forms the hypothalamus, which forms the hypothalamus. So what actually arranged these things, and what is the arrangement of these epithalamus, thalamus and the hypothalamus? Let me draw another figure. So this is the cerebrum, this is the cerebellum, pons, medulla and the spinal cord. So this is the pons, medulla, cerebellum, cerebrum. So here, as you know, cerebrum, which present on the nervous band or the seat, which is known as the corpus callosum. So below the corpus callosum, there is the diencephalon. So this is the region of the diencephalon. There is the another nerve band present which connect the corpus callosum with the diencephalon, which is known as the fornix. So here it is not our discussion now, so let me raise it. So this is the position of the diencephalon. Suppose that this is the third ventricle. Where the roof, this is the roof of the third ventricle. This is the roof of the third ventricle. This is the roof of the third ventricle. This is the roof of the third ventricle, and which forms the epithalamus. And such epithalamus, the posterior region of the epithalamus, which has a stalk, and which hold a ball-like structure, a oval body, which contains the oval body. This is known as the pineal gland. Pineal body or the pineal gland. Such pineal gland which secrete the melatonin hormone, and such hormone which regulate day and night biological activity of our body, and somehow such pineal body also regulate the sexual or the reproductive behavior of the organism. So the epithalamus, the posterior wall of the epithalamus, which has the stalk, and such stalk terminating into a body which is known as the pineal body, and such pineal body secrete the melatonin hormone. And this epithalamus, the anterior portion of the epithalamus, also there is the nuclei. As I told that nuclei, this is the cluster of cell bodies. So another nuclei present, and such nuclei is known as the habenular nuclei. This is known as the habenular nuclei. So this is the habenular nuclei. Such habenular nuclei which controls the emotional response related to smell. So the emotional response related to smell. So this is the epithalamus. The wall of, suppose that this is the wall of third ventricle. This is the third ventricle, the wall of third ventricle which forms the thalamus. So this portion It may be named as thalamus. Thalamus. So the nuclear mass which form the thalamus, they are present both the right and left wall of the third ventricle. That's why they form the right and left thalami. Such thalamus, this is the actual relay center of the sensory impulses. So number of sensory impulses, they are released from such thalamus. So such thalamus, it relay the sensation of the hearing, visual, touch, pressure, pain, temperature, except olfactory sensation. So this is the actual relay center of different senses or reflexes. So different senses like the hearing, visual, touch, pressure, pain, temperature, except olfactory sensation, all the sensation, the somatic sensation, the actual relay, the thalamus is the actual relay center of somatic sensation like visual, like hearing, like temperature, pain, except olfactory. All the sensations, the somatic sensation relay from such thalamus. So this is the actual relay center of the somatic sensation. The floor of the third ventricle, suppose that this is the floor of the third ventricle, which also contains the neural mass and which is known as the hypothalamus. So hypothalamus present below the thalamus, epithalamus which present above the thalamus or in front of thalamus. Hypothalamus. The hypothalamus at the anterior region, such hypothalamus, it also has the stalk and which contains another oval body, and this oval body is known as hypophysis. This is known as the hypophysis, and the stalk is known as the infundibulum. So hypothalamus, it is protected by the silla turcica of sphenoid bone. So the hypothalamus, which is protected by silla turcica of sphenoid bone of skull. So hypothalamus, which present below the thalamus, it is protected by the silla turcica of sphenoid bone. Such hypothalamus, so this is the hypothalamus, such hypothalamus which also contains different parts like mammillary body, like optic chiasma. So this is the position of the optic chiasma. Where the nerve arises from right eye, cross over the nerve arises from the left eye. So which forms a cross like structure, the over crossing of two nerves comes out from the right eye and the left eye, and which is known as the optic chiasma. So mammillary body, it is nothing but it is also a swollen oval nuclei present on the surface of the hypothalamus. So these two things, mammillary body and the optic chiasma, it is visible at the ventral view of such brain. So let me draw the ventral view of the brain. Suppose that this is the cerebral hemisphere, this is the temporal lobe, this is the frontal lobe, this is the temporal lobe, This is the pons. This is the spinal cord. So this is the pons. This is the medulla oblongata. This is the spinal cord. This portion is the cerebellum. So this is the cerebellum. There is the optic chiasma. There is the optic chiasma. So this is the optic chiasma, and this is the infundibulum, and there is the hypophysis. So this is the hypophysis, this is the infundibulum, and this red color, this is the optic chiasma. So optic chiasma, this is the crossover of nerves which comes out from the right and the left eye of the body, and which form the cross. So the right nerve which comes out from the right eye, which goes to the left side of the brain, and the nerves which comes out from the left eye, which goes to the right side of the brain. That's why it forms a cross, which is known as the optic chiasma. Now it is visible here. So behind the optic chiasma, there is the swollen body. There is the swollen body. Optic chiasma. So behind the optic chiasma, there is the one pair of swollen body, which is known as mammillary bodies. This is known as mammillary bodies. So these mammillary bodies, this is nothing but, this is the nuclei of the brain. This is the ovarian structure and present on the surface of the hypothalamus. So suppose that this is the mammillary body. Such mammillary body which regulate or which controls some of the reflexes related to eating, like swallowing, like chewing. So this mammillary body, it controls or regulates some of the reflex related to eating, like swallowing, like chewing. This is the mammillary body. Hypothalamus, which contains different centers and regulate the different activities of our body. Hypothalamus, which contains appetite and satiate center, which regulate the desire of food. Hypothalamus also contains sex center, or it regulates the sexual desire of the body, or the libido of the body. It regulates the sexual desire, the sexual function of the body. Hypothalamus also control the sleeping pattern. It contains the sleeping center, that's why it regulates the sleeping of our body. And such hypothalamus also contains emotional reflexes center, like sweating, reflexes center like sweating, fatigue, etc. So hypothalamus is very important part which regulates or which contains different center like appetite, satiate center, sex center, sleeping center, and very important thing is that such hypothalamus also regulate the temperature of our body. So thermoregulation center also present in hypothalamus. So these are the different function of the hypothalamus. Epithalamus, the habenular nuclei which present anterior region of the epithalamus, which regulate the emotional reflexes related to the smell, emotional reflexes related to smell, and epithalamus, which contains the pineal body, which secrete the melatonin. That's why such melatonin, which regulate the day and night biological behavior or biological clock of the body, and such pineal gland also regulate the reproductive behavior of the animal. That's why pineal body, also known as biological clock of the animal or biological clock of our body. This is known as the biological clock of our body. Epithalamus, it has also a very important function. So the thalamus, now come to the thalamus. The thalamus, which contains number of sensory relay center, it relay the different somatic reflexes or the senses. So the thalamus, it relay the somatic sensation like hearing, like visual, like touch, like pain, like temperature, except olfactory. So thalamus, it also required for the acquisition of knowledge and the awareness. So thalamus, it is the important for acquisition of knowledge and awareness. So these are the different functions of the different part of the diencephalon. Thank you for watching.